People who follow competitions get a lot of mileage out of arguing about who they think is the GOAT, the greatest of all time. My hot take is that I think that entire conversation is pretty silly and meaningless. There are certainly some players or teams that go on massive streaks of dominance, undefeated seasons, beating every notable player, breaking records for numbers of tournaments won. There are some really significant achievements that sometimes herald a competitor that simply won't lose against anyone else. Those are worth talking about and congratulating for the sake of building the story of the scene and measuring success, but that's not the job of a competitor. Competition isn't about who the greatest of all time is. Competition is about who the better player is on that day, in that match, in that moment. Competition does not stagnate until a game stops being played entirely. As long as there is a next tournament, there can be a new winner. And no matter how strong the old winner was, they're going to have to prove they're strong enough to win now. It wouldn't be worth it if this weren't the case. If we want to be better, there has to be a next result for us to use to prove it, another data point. If you're in a tournament, that next data point is the only one that matters. The fact that you won 7 times in a row doesn't change that you could lose the 8th time. If you beat someone the last 9 times but they beat you the 10th time, on that day, they were the better player. Sure, there may come another day where you'll start another 9 tournament win streak against that player, and people will write the loss off as a fluke. But competitors live in the present, because you have control over the present right now. You have no control over the past, and you'll have control over the future when it comes, but the present is being written right now, so that's what it's your job to attend to. Maybe you were sick that day. Maybe something happened in your personal life that was distracting. X, Y, or Z thing could have happened that had an unusual negative impact on your play. I would still say that on that day, under those circumstances, because those were the circumstances that mattered on that day, you were the weaker player. Now, if those circumstances are unlikely to ever happen again, and you go right back to winning from then on, one would be foolish to assume that you'll be the weaker player on most days. But it's important not to give yourself excuses, at least until the tournament is done and you can unwind from it. Because no single day is ever going to be perfect. There will always be something that goes at least a little bit wrong. You have to be resilient and adaptable to things going wrong to be able to function at all, lest you devolve into a never-ending fountain of excuses that blind you from the steps you could have taken to offset whatever weaknesses you showed up with. Who is to blame if you show up tired? Maybe there was something that was outside of your control that caused it, but that's not your opponent's fault. That's not the tournament organizer's fault. That's something that's your responsibility as a competitor, something only you can reasonably be expected to make any attempt to control. When you show up to a tournament, you tell everyone you lose to GG because that validates the win for them. If you only ever invalidate the win because of the excuses, what the Smash community would call Johning, you're going to fail to be present in that moment. You're going to fail to learn, and you will develop a weaker and weaker mentality the more you let yourself do this. If there are excuses to be made for you, they are to be made by somebody else. If that loss is a fluke, that's not for you to decide. That's for the analysts who aren't having to play the game for themselves and can look at it objectively. They don't need to use the same brain they use for making their observations that they have to use for keeping themselves motivated and focused on the next in-game interaction. You do. If you want to do that analysis for yourself in the aftermath of the event, deciding where those results put you in the grand scheme of things for the purpose of setting your own goals, so be it. But as soon as the next tournament starts, you'd better get those thoughts out of your head because you have games to focus on winning. When it comes to winning those games, analysts and top players talk all the time about optimal strategies, the metagame, the weapons and roles you should try to pick up to give you the best chances. There's a lot of value in those conversations for learning the game, but something that's important to remember on the day of the event is that those tactics and strategies need to be practiced. They're also tactics and strategies that tend to be developed in response to an expected set of tactics and strategies that you think you'll see from the opposing team. Squeezer is one of the strongest weapons in the game, one of the strongest main weapons ever put in Splatoon. But if you haven't been practicing the tap shots and can't get a fast fire rate while holding the weapon steady, Squeezer is not a strong weapon for you in that moment, at that tournament, at the only time that it matters. If you wanted to unlock the potential of Squeezer, you should have been practicing it, and learning from the players and analysts who have been praising it. Otherwise, an off-meta weapon that you're more competent at playing will be a stronger choice. Maybe you don't quite care as much about winning at that tournament and you're willing to play the weapon for the sake of learning it. Maybe you pull it out when you win game 1 and you're confident you can win the deciding games even if you drop one from playing a less familiar option. Maybe you're treating the whole tournament as practice and there's another event later on that you'll approach as the real test that you're aiming to win, and then you plan on really being able to make that new weapon choice work. But if you want to win the match today, your best option is to play what you will win with your skill set on this day, in the present, right now, in response to what they are playing. That's why, for example, Mickey Mart, the winners of Genesis X, went coolerless for the whole tournament. It wasn't that they didn't see the potential of the special or that they wanted other people to think they were cool for playing off meta. They just didn't have anyone who was really well practiced on a cooler weapon, so they went with what they were practiced on instead. At tip-top levels of play, rather than seeing exactly what people expect the metagame to be, you'll often see counter-meta strategies, or team-specific strategies intended to play against specifically the opponents you knew would be threats early on. There are broad patterns we can talk about as the metagame, but what really wins games at a certain point isn't how well someone can recite the meta strategy. It's the small, granular, detailed adaptations teams make based on the opponents they're faced with at that exact moment. Every match that's ever been played is a different puzzle with a different solution. And while you can generalize a lot of the skills it takes to solve a wide variety of puzzles, the circumstances of each one are different. And with that much volatility, it's truly remarkable we ever have consistent champions. It also makes comparing champions across different time periods kind of meaningless. An average Melee player from 2024 would be the best player in the world in 2003. Does that mean that the player in 2003 that pioneered dozens of new techniques and developed their character in a way every subsequent player has built on since isn't great? If we call that pioneer from 2003 greater, then what chance does someone in 2024 have of being that great? In 2003, there was so much more for the pioneer to discover than there is now. But the pioneer may not have had the skill set to optimize their gameplay to the level of precision that's now required, even if they'd been fed all the information that's been discovered since. Some players, on the other hand, may not have the creativity and intuition to be pioneers, but they can take knowledge that's fed to them by a team of lab monsters who are pushing the game and learn how to apply it to a degree of technical consistency beyond anyone else, and that makes them very difficult to beat. When we start comparing players outside of their times and places, it becomes an exercise in semantics. What does great even mean? To be a pioneer? To be an optimizer? To have a longer win streak, to beat the best players at their best? It says more about what we value as analysts at that point than it does about each player's achievements. The only way we can really objectively compare any two players in a competition is who beat who in the tournament on that day, in that place, under those circumstances. Everything else is just small talk conversation so that we nerds have something we can talk to each other about at parties.